Welcome to Transformational Pathways, a podcast created by Toastmasters District 46 in the greater New York area, where we share conversations from influencers within the Toastmasters community and people whose lives have positively transformed by walking down the Toastmasters path. Whether you're just getting started in your career, have had recent career changes, or you're navigating different languages, we're here to help you build confidence by discovering new tools, overcoming your fears to find your voice, and engaging in a thriving community. Enjoy today's episode.
Hi, and welcome to yet another show of Transformational Pathways. Today we have with us a very special guest. Please help me welcome Gerlinde Brixius to our episode. Hi, Gerlinde, welcome.
Hello, Anu, and hello, listeners.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Gerlinde, I looked at your profile and it looks so diverse and interesting. Yeah, you've done a variety of things and I'm so interested to hear more about it. I'm sure our audience are also curious to learn more about you. So tell me a little bit about yourself, your upbringing, where you come from, and how you came to Toastmasters.
Well, it's interesting. I know you mentioned transformational pathways as a topic for your podcast. And that's really what life is all along. And since the early days, born and the early days raised in Austria, moved to Germany, moved on to France for studies, packed a suitcase out to Asia, and then a whole container to come to New York. So that's the life path in a nutshell. But along the way, there have been many transformations. And I would say Toastmaster, I resisted it for, I'd say, 20 years. But eventually, it has been the most significant piece in the transformational journey and going forward.
Wow, interesting. You mentioned moving from country to different continents. What took you there?
Well, I have asked myself this question a lot as well. As early as 6, maybe 7 years old, I can remember I wanted to learn foreign languages. And how can a 6-year-old know why they want to learn foreign languages? Right? But I wanted, and I grabbed every piece I could. I listened to long wave radios then, to languages I had no idea what they were. But I started learning, and eventually, as soon as I could, getting engaged with work in the company my father worked, in the export division. They let me during school vacation. They let me do little things in the export division. And then as soon as I could study abroad, and from there you get interested. You hear stories. We talked about stories earlier, that people love stories. Well, it's really stories, for example, of the Empress of China, that I read in French when I was in France. I said, I have to go to China. And yeah, but I couldn't go directly, actually. So I would say, chickened out from going to China. This was in the 90s. So I went to Singapore first.
Your life reads like a book.
Well, we say we have between German and French, we have a saying that Singapore is the Switzerland of the East. So for a girl coming out of studies, it just felt very safe. And I thought maybe tip the toe first into the continent and then carry on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And your profile mentions a degree in law, but that you're also an international banker.
Yes.
How did this come about?
Well, I really set out to study languages, foreign languages, because that was the passion from 6 years old. And when I finally landed in France at the campus, I had 3 months left. I had 3 months time before starting the studies. And in those 3 months, I learned so much French that I thought, why would I sit another 3 years or 4 years in the university, studying vocabulary, cramming grammar and exams, and already learn it freely. So that was actually a moment of crisis. And a friend suggested I ask his uncle. I have a conversation with his uncle, who was a corporate attorney for a power, how do you call this? A nuclear power plant, actually. And so he was an attorney there. He gave me some ideas and that I actually could fully do it. So in France, I studied law instead of languages. And that's how, when I moved out to Singapore, of course, I was looking for a legal internship rather than any other office jobs. Yeah, that's how that came about.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so how many languages do you speak today?
Well, French, Italian, so I spent a little bit time in between in Italy, Mandarin, because that's what I learned while I was out in Asia, English and German.
Wow, 5 languages. I'm curious, are your Toastmaster clubs all English? Are they bilingual or more?
Well, it's very interesting. So I'm in several Toastmaster clubs engaged. The oldest one, I would say, is probably my home club, and then a few others just due to timing. And they're all English speaking. But my corporate club, I work for an international bank, so my corporate club also speaks English. However, I don't think there are any very few European descendant Americans. Many of them actually are from Asia, and which probably has to do with the bank's heritage. But so it really feels very international, although the language we speak is all English.
Mm-hmm. I also see you're interested in healing and natural lifestyle practices. This is an area of interest for me. So can you tell me a little bit more about what you do in this area?
Well, so healing. I come from a region, a country which is influenced by ancient medicine. So in Europe, from Austria to Germany, but also France, and we have a saint. Her name is Hildegard of Bingen. She was a nun at the age of 8, I think. She was delivered by her parents. So this is from the Middle Ages, the year 1000 roughly. She was delivered by the parents into the monastery, became a nun until 40 or 45, and then became the abbess for the women, which were housed in the abbey with the monks together. But she decided the time was ripe for the women, the nuns, to move out and create their own abbey. And for another 40 years, she led the abbey, which gives her, I think, almost 70 plus years of spiritual life. And in those 70 plus years, she was really a doctor for women who came to the monastery for delivering babies. So they had the women came to have their examinations there, especially the farmers, which didn't have access to any other medical practices. Then she had, of course, a garden. And in this sense, she was very different from the nuns at the time, or the monks, or even the spiritual beliefs, because she defended the idea that a garden was there to bring joy, and that the nuns and the monks and any spiritual person was actually allowed to experience joy. And she has a recipe which is called Cookie of Joy. And with all the slimming down we do these days and the grain allergies and this allergy, the Cookie of Joy, I can tell you, they definitely are worth a try. It's a very simple recipe, but cookies of joy. And that's the whole healing process. And she has composed a lot of music as well. So very holistic person. From her spiritual life, the music life, the leadership she offered the nuns, the gardening, the natural life, and with that, the whole cosmologic aspects. And that was really the early influence. And then in Asia, obviously, there were other influences from Asian traditional medical practices.
Right. Uh-huh. So when did you step into the healing practice?
When did I step in? Sometimes I like to think as early as a little child when I went instead. I never have seen a candy in a plastic wrapper until I was 7 or 8 years old and we had moved to the city. Until then, I always had a mug, and with the mug walked into the garden and could grab the low-hanging berries from raspberries, gooseberries, strawberries. Obviously, they were on the ground. And so I would say those, if I could say healing, the earliest days of healing was in the garden with my grandparents. But more consciously and seriously consciously, I would say when I came to the US and I really could I lived by myself and I could practice things. And explain the things I was doing at home in speeches at Toastmaster. That was actually an important component.
Very interesting. Since you mentioned Toastmasters, what brought you to Toastmasters?
That was actually a very painful incident, painful for me. I heard about Toastmasters first time in Beijing. A friend brought me to a little restaurant, and in the back of the restaurant, there was a group meeting, and it happened to be a Toastmasters meeting. Didn't think too much about it, but when I came to the US, to New York, I'd say 10 years later, I realized I really didn't feel maybe confident enough in speaking English next to my American or born and raised here colleagues. And it started with the phone. When I introduced my name on the phone, people said, "Who? What? Can you spell that for me?" And I thought it was awful. So I hired a speech coach, and the speech coach suggested I use Toastmasters. So I actually went to I visited Toastmasters, which was SEC Rough Riders at the time. And that was in 2003. And it was so impressive that I never returned. I thought, no, I cannot do this. But then 10 years later, as I give it another try and still didn't feel it, was very regimented. And I felt, I just can't do this. There's no way I can compete with these people. But then in 2015, in a shelter, an overnight shelter, I was supposed to host 12 men arriving by bus. And one of them gets off the bus and says to me, "Hi, I'm Bill. I'm in charge and you can go home." I was speechless. I just couldn't say anything. I did go home, just complied. And I thought, well, if these people can watch themselves. And it was true. He had an arrangement with the church where they should sleep because he was a little bit in a special situation. But it just got me to think and say, well, if these people can watch themselves, then what am I supposed to do? And that ugly, ugly, ugly little voice started coming up saying, you have to use your voice. Because there are people out there, they have very great talent, but they don't maybe have the connection, or they need somebody to advocate for them. And that's going to be your role. So I said, well, I can't do this by myself. So I went back to Rough Riders, SEC Rough Riders, for the third time. And this time I registered myself as a member, and then I just stayed. And this was in 2015, yeah.
So Rough Riders is a Toastmaster club?
Yes, sales executive club for Rough Riders after the name of the room in the Roosevelt Hotel in New York City, where it was held in the 50s. And ever since, the name never changed. The meeting forward never changed. It was always on a Thursday with lunch. And later on in the Bar Association. The Bar Association has a room with big shelves and portraits hanging, paintings of former Bar Association presidents. And that made it just so strict and so severe. But once you get to know the people and you deliver your icebreaker and you get involved as an officer and you really help other people along the way, it becomes just the most fantastic thing there is.
Absolutely. And in your bio, you mentioned that it was at Rough Riders using speech projects that you identified the social cause that was closest to your heart. What social cause did you identify with?
Well, at the time I was engaged, so in 2015, I was engaged in very many different things. And so one of them, the shelter overnight, and I realized, oops, they can do it by themselves. And I need to use my voice. And I thought, well, which cause do I need to use my voice? And the things I was involved other was meal programs. We had human trafficking programs at the time. This was all through the church. I looked into healing, chakra healing and spiritual healing in general. So over a series of 10 speeches, which is the Competent Communicator Manual, which is really the starter kit for Toastmasters, new Toastmasters, I used those 10 speeches every time to give a speech on something I already did, and then added something new. For example, so interesting, Toastmaster in prison. That was a research project, Toastmaster in prison, and how intelligent people who are actually sitting in a prison can talk, and what it does to them when whenever they are released, they have the experience that they actually can use their voice instead of knocking someone down or even using a gun or something. And that they can ask for things, that they can help other things. They organize their own Toastmaster, that they're actually leaders in their own right. And so the repeat offense is much reduced, maybe 10% instead of 50 or 60%. And I thought these things are so interesting, but there was nothing around here in Manhattan where I live where I could actually do this. So I continued searching further, and what then really came up is engaging in sustainable living practices. And that really has become the field ever since, I'd say, 2018, maybe, when I was done with this first series. And at the same time, my company also engaged in sustainability actively. And then the two came together: sustainable living, sustainability in the world. And that's really the focus now.
That's very interesting. It's also one of those pressing topics of the day, given climate change and global warming.
Right.
Tell me a little bit more about the work that you do in sustainable living practices and what we as ordinary people can do to switch to a sustainable lifestyle.
Yeah, so sustainable lifestyle for the ordinary person, the you and me and our friends and colleagues and the families. If we live in a city, especially like New York, we can actually feel good about ourselves because a lot of the driving carbon footprint falls off. We walk a lot. We eat quite healthy, so we have street markets and those things. But people who don't live in cities that have markets like this, or that where you can walk to where you need to get, definitely it will be the food practices to look at, and also the home, so the individual house, cooling, warming, cars. How many cars do I really need to drive to the post office or today, or can I do it tomorrow? Do I need to drive at all, or maybe can I really walk? Make it an exercise practice. Those are the simple things. But in a city like New York, it's still the buildings and ultimately the stuck traffic that really creates problems. And the buildings are the biggest polluters in a city. And that's why the city has actually made it mandatory to reduce the size of the heaters in buildings. So they need to be upgraded. There's a lot of electrification going on right now all over the city. And those are, for a place like New York City, where maybe a lot of your listeners maybe, that's really what we can do. Pay attention to how we cool our apartment. Do we really need to cool it? Do we really need to have it that hot? Do we really need a half an hour shower? Or if it's that long, could it be a bath that uses less water? Can the shower be healthier? Can it be a cooler shower, which is another movement altogether, the Wim Hof idea of cold showers? And yeah, so those would be, I think, maybe the three top things, right? The building, the food, and the water we use.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, as we switch to a sustainable lifestyle, we also switch to a healthier lifestyle. So
Yes.
you opt to walk versus take a ride, or use a public transport versus having a car, etc. So small changes and tweaks can have a big impact on the environment and our own lifestyle, right?
Absolutely.
And I hope the work that you do gets more and more support, and that we have more and more people switching to a sustainable lifestyle. It's really important.
Well, one way of thinking about it, Anu, is that, and everybody who listens really, is that there is nothing that's bad for the human being that would be good for the earth, or the other way around. There is nothing that would be good for the earth that's not also good for us. Definitely. A friend the other day, she said, "Oh my God, Gerlinde, do you know, I have heard that the hair dye from the hair salons, which they release into the soil, is bad for the soil." I said, well, first of all, it's bad for the head, for the person, because it goes straight from the scalp through the bloodstream, and it's a very sensitive skin. So any kind of hair dye goes through the scalp directly in the bloodstream of the person who receives the hair treatment, the coloring treatment, right? That's really where it starts. The same for nail polish. Now they're paying more attention, maybe more water-based products. But those are really things we don't maybe think about. But anything that's bad for the earth first is bad for us. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, just moving on to other areas of interest that you have, and you have a lot, right? You mentioned cleaning rivers. Where did this happen?
Oh, so there is an organization it's actually a worldwide organization called Riverkeeper. Riverkeeper, and they're tied together through Waterkeeper Alliance globally, but in the US and especially in New York, every year they have actions going on where they gather through large corporations, and many big brand names participate, organize a Saturday morning, picking up the debris from along the beach, replanting, and it could be either along the East River, especially where the islands are in the northern part of East River, or on Hudson River, so, which is very large, and it includes everything from fishing out the dead wood as much and putting all that together, as much as literally replanting and repairing and replacing the green strip. And the Hudson River strip is very long. I don't know how many miles, but it really goes from downtown all the way out of Manhattan. Right?
Wow. So how can one join this, and when do you do it?
It happens actually last Saturday. Last Saturday was the Hudson River cleanup. But there are more. So Riverkeeper would be one organization to just go online and have a look when their programs are. And that will definitely give them a good idea. And then from there, just search cleanup if it's in the city, right? Like New York.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lot of useful advice for our listeners. You also mentioned working with students, third graders, teaching money.
Yes. Yes, so all large organizations have these partnerships programs to support the not-for-profits in the community. And for my bank, obviously, before I worked in another bank, and one of the big themes and the easy themes, of course, is money. And however, how we teach it, it used to be taught, I'd say 15 years ago, in terms of budgeting, saving money, and it was very personal and pocket money and so forth. But now it's actually very much branched out. So the third graders we are teaching now, the money program, is that you can do a number of things with them. You can earn it first, save it, spend it, and give it. So that's really the four things that you can do with money. And these kids, they learn to become real entrepreneurs during the program. So if they have to come up with a plan, how am I going to earn my money? Maybe I open an ice cream stand or some lemonade, or I carry bags for somebody. Now I have the money. What do I do with it? And they get to reinvest it in the community. They get to reinvest it in buildings, for example. And they learn where would you put, what kinds of buildings we have. So we have mixed use, we have public buildings like library, city hall, and so forth. We have the residential building, we have the schools. So they get, or the shop buildings, so they get to organize the city. Where would you put all these buildings? And then how would you reinvest your money? What do you do with your money? Hire employees and then give some to somebody who built a hotel in the city. Said, well, the money I don't need, I give it to people who don't have a place to stay. And then they can come, so they're 8 years old, I think, right, at that level. But that's what they learn, yeah. So it's actually fascinating.
It's fascinating. I'm sure it's fascinating for grown-ups too. I would be interested. But more importantly, how can parents enroll their kids for this program?
Oh, that's through the school. So there are classes. It depends. So we the school classes I had. I even had like 3 school classes on the screen, and I really have a lot of respect for the teachers now, because it's not easy to work with school classes online. But that's what we did. So they had, the classroom was online. And it's the schools in Queens. Most of the schools were actually in Queens, which otherwise wouldn't even benefit from the programs because it would be too far to travel there. But via Zoom, we actually could offer those programs to schools that otherwise wouldn't benefit from it.
Very interesting. You are definitely very invested in the community, and you do a variety of things to help. Tell me a little bit more about working at Toastmasters. Aside from being a member, What different leadership roles have you played in?
Well, a variety, actually. And the first one was to be the officer in charge of membership. And it's really, anyone ever invited to be the officer for membership, I really recommend go for it, because you learn to know your club very quickly. You learn to know the people, and also you really learn how to organize a similar-minded network very quickly. Then the year after, I was president, and that was the year Pathways was introduced. And that was very interesting, because one might think, and a lot of people actually do, well, to have all this responsibility is just a club, maybe not worth my time, or it's too much work for all the other things I have going on now. My experience was, because I did not know what I was getting myself into, so I said yes, because of the person who asked me. I thought, well, if this person asks me, then there must be a reason. There's something that he saw that probably it would be beneficial for me. So I just said yes. And it turns out that, number one, to be an officer, and the buck stops with you, in this case, the club president, you learn in a low-stake environment to be really the ultimate responsible person. So for anyone who wants to launch their own business, that's so invaluable. And low stake doesn't mean it's not important. Low stake means that everybody in the room and the club supports you, and even the district, actually, for that matter. So our district officers are there to help us with training, or if we have a question. And ultimately, if even the district couldn't solve it, there is the Toastmaster International organization that can help out with specific questions if there is an issue that arises. But when the buck stops with you, it shifts the mindset totally and creates a sense of really autonomy that as an employee, we never can have.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think you summed it up well. It either stops with you or everything begins with you.
Correct.
Yeah. Gerlinde, what would your message be to our audience, especially those who have not joined Toastmasters or are hearing about it for the first time?
Toastmasters, and this goes back, Anu, to your introduction, Transformational Pathways. So the way Toastmaster today helps people prepare speeches so they can practice speaking, that's on the surface, preparing to speak. However, underneath, there is this opportunity to totally transform our own worldviews and to broaden them. But it requires us to change and to adapt. And this change now is going very fast. The companies, the corporations around us change. The communities around us change as well. This pathway, the way Toastmaster International helps us organizing our speeches, helps us to think long-term broadly. A pathway, it used to be, actually I have one here, little manuals like this. It has 5 speeches in there. And that's a little theme. So this one happens to be speaking to inform. And that's what we learn, how to inform someone. Today's pathway really starts from the introduction of self through learning the leadership style, the communication style. Those are very deep subjects. I can leave it at just saying, use your hands, keep eye contact. That's on the surface. But why am I not keeping eye contact? What happened in my childhood that makes me look away? Or what happened in my childhood that makes me say no when the opportunity to lead comes up? And then go after those additional research projects. But Pathways really helps to organize it. And there are 11 now, 11 different. So you can really have a long trajectory to be an effective coach, to have a visionary communication style that's changed leadership. You can just practice presentations or being persuasive. You can practice humor. You can put them together, work on 2 or 3 paths at the same time, and get inspired by 2 or 3 ideas. But ultimately, the person who finishes the program after 15, 16 speeches should ideally no longer be the person who started it with the icebreaker, the self-introduction at the beginning.
That is a transformation one should seek when they go through the Pathways program.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why? Because that's when life is really enjoyable and we really find our purpose and can fulfill it. And a group with whom we interact, we're not speaking to ourselves whether it's on Zoom or whether it's in a real meeting room. We present to a group, we receive feedback ad hoc and thought through. And all of this contributes to us enjoying life more fully if we go with that flow.
Absolutely. Well said, Gerlinde. I thank you for being on the show today. You're a multifaceted personality, and it was a true honor to listen to you and your experiences. I'm sure our audience will also benefit from hearing your stories. I hope they look at the different community options out there to help and give back to society, and also sign up for Toastmasters if they haven't done so already. So thank you once again for being on our show.
Thank you, Anu, for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us on Transformational Pathways. If you enjoyed today's episode or got anything out of it, please rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're interested in learning more about Toastmasters District 46, check out the link in the show notes below.